It's quite a big thing for me to be addressing this audience because, of course, I don't know much about contemplative practices, but even as a scientist, I'm just a graduate student. So thank you for having me here. And the idea that I want to talk about today is extending our senses. And in the context of what Geshe-la just said, I think, there's a lot to talk about, a lot to think about. Because in a way, it's about flipping the relationship. We talk about, I think what we just talked about is technology that is coming out of thinking and explorations of the mind, but what about technology in service of understanding the mind? And I think that is the sense with which we are approaching this. So also, we've spoken a lot about how telescopes and other gadgets let us see really far and much more than what we would have normally seen. But I also want to bring into attention something as humble as the blind man's cane. Because in that sense, for a blind man using a cane, he is extending his sense. But it's something that helps him actually do something in the world. And it's also a sense that's persistent. It becomes a part of his body. And that is a very different relationship than one has when one is looking through a telescope. And so just keeping that in mind. I want to also talk about what we mean by experimental philosophy. I think it says that, initially the talk's title was Hum of the Universe Within, and I will come back to that. I'll come to it in the end of the slides, actually. But to begin with, the larger perspective is that we work on something that can be called experimental philosophy, which is basically we're interested in philosophy of mind and philosophy of perception to be specific. But we use experimental techniques to investigate this. And like I said before, technology in the service of exploring these things. So the sort of stuff we use is cheap electronics that anyone can work with. And it's a little playful, it's non-invasive, and it's basically, it helps us play with the different relationships between our brain and body and senses and the world. And but before I get into how exactly we do this, I'm just going to give the backdrop philosophy, the sort of stuff we're interested in. So a good way to start in this whole big world of philosophy is to ask this question. And a lot of philosophies will say it's a stupid question to ask, but nevertheless, it's a good question to begin with. And it's to ask where the experiencer is. So when we're talking about sense organs, it's quite clear that at the periphery, they're quite mechanical. And at some point, they make a contribution to our experience. So when does that shift occur? Or is it a sensible question to ask when sense organs end and when experience begins? So this is the caricature that's often seen. I think Chris had something like this in his slides also. Which is basically to say, if you have this mechanical sense organ, then finally somebody needs to see it, somebody needs to experience it, and this is how it's often caricatured. But researchers in this field have many different ideas, many different alternatives to this some simple cartoon. And one of them, which again I couldn't help but caricature, is that the experiencer is the brain. And there's a lot of evidence for this, because a lot of what the brain seems to be doing is correlated with the sort of experiences we're having, and that's what neuroscience shows. But it also leads to ridiculous ideas like this, where you can just have a brain in a vat and you can pump it in with some electrical input and you can fool it into thinking it's taking a walk outside in the sun. Maybe it's with a dog. Maybe it's walking his dog. But the brain having a dog is... So a lot of people then want to extend this idea to a brain inside a body. Let's say the experiencer is the full body. And that also has its issues, because for one thing, when we're dreaming, we're experiencing, and the body doesn't seem to be doing much. There are a lot of little things that can be spoken about, like we move our eyes and maybe we move our hands a little bit. But on the whole, it's a tricky thing. And we can talk about that more later. Then there's another idea that the experiencer is actually a passive Atma that resides in us. It leaves us when we die, maybe enters someone else, But on the whole, it's immaterial. And then there is the idea that it's, the experiencer is just all over, out in the world. So, when I write, the pen is part of the experiencer. This whole mechanism, everything that's participating is part of the experiencer. And so there's another caricature where you have your mind all over the world. But, and then one idea that I really like is that there is no self in the sense of a permanent experience. And this is an idea I've encountered briefly in the little about Buddhism that I've read. And the idea is that everything is interdependent and everything's in flux, and there's actually no need to invoke this idea of this person sitting inside us. And I think cognitive science and the way it's heading is also heading to something similar. I'm not sure if it's the same thing and what exactly the overlap is, but this is the sort of new view that's forming in cognitive science. On the left, you have this old view of a movie being projected inside the head, which you can call an internal representation, but then you need someone to see it. And then the new view is more about perceiving being about how to do things in the world. And in this case, it's more about this person rotating the triangle and knowing if he rotates it this much, it's going to look like this. He doesn't actually have to do it, but all that knowledge is what makes the experience, a knowledge of action. And this is a difficult idea to grapple with, at least for me. And I think something very concrete that we can talk about is actually one of these so-called sensory extensions. So this is an experiment which I find very interesting. It's got a big name, this whole machine setup. You can just call it TVSS. And what's happening here is that this girl is blind. And to see the world, she's using this camera, but it's very interesting how she's using it, because what's happening here is whatever the camera sees is converted into the activity of vibrators on her back. So it's like a tactile screen on her back. And so if one pixel on the camera becomes brighter, this thing vibrates faster. So if there are 20 by 20 pixels on the camera, there are 20 by 20 vibrators on her back. And of course, initially it just feels like some strange sort of tickling to her, and it's sort of useless. But as she tries to do things, as she moves the camera and sees how the tickling changes as she moves the camera, how things change when she's trying to do things. So you have the doctors were helping her. You had this, they got her to try and recognize simple objects like a cross or a circle or something. And through this training, and it was about 2 to 3 weeks, and that's a long time to try and explore something completely unfamiliar. But by the end of which, the experience was transformed from something purely tactile, purely like someone's tickling your back, to something like vision. And I think that's what's amazing about this. And it goes back to the idea that it's really the nature of doing that's determining the nature of experience, and not. So, for example, seeing doesn't have anything to do with the eye necessarily. She's not using her eye at all, but her experiences are a lot like seeing. And I think some of the anecdotes that sort of give a better picture of this is that one of the doctors who made this, he actually changed the zoom of the camera without telling her. And so what happened is something in front of her became big really fast. And visually, that always means something's coming at you. And in fact, she ducked, whereas nothing was coming at her, it was just the zoom of the camera. And again, this talks about perception as being related to what you're doing in the world and what's happening in the world. And what we can take from this is that. Also, one more thing that I want to say is that it's not exactly like seeing. Of course, the experience that she had, no one else has. And maybe some other people have tried, and it's not an easy thing to do, to train with something like this. But it might not be strictly visual, exactly how we see the world, but it's something new. It's neither tactile nor visual. It's something new. And it's a new way of doing things in the world, and it's a new way of generating experience. And what we want to do is use this sort of setup to really study how experiences are generated and how our senses work at all. And one challenge is when you're doing this sort of stuff is the training that's involved. So you need to have persistently be working at this new way of doing things, and it needs to be relevant with what you're doing. So there was another group of researchers that tried something, and it's called the field space belt. And so it was inspired by how birds can detect magnetic fields and sort of go about navigating. And it was just they were playing around and they wanted to see if this can be done for humans. And well, there's this belt which detects magnetic fields, and then it vibrates, so you always know which way north is. And what happens is after 3 weeks of wearing this, people get really used to. I mean, of course, we already have our eyes and we can figure out which way things are without the help of any belt like this. But it does add something. And in fact, one of the interesting things was that the person started dreaming. This sort of sense, the whole magnetic field sense, started being part of her dreams. And I think that was really interesting. But anyway, coming back to what we want to do is we want to take something like this and we want to turn it inward. And so the next slide's not going to show up, but but what it basically shows is just the fact that if you think of the brain activity as producing some sort of an electromagnetic wave, which you can think of it as a faint light coming out of your head all the time. Now, what if you had a direct way of sensing that light? And that's a new inward sense, to be able to sense your own brain. The thing we're working on, like I was saying, is it looks something like this. So you have this EEG that's picking up your brain waves. I think it's missing on that side. This side. It's not this side. So it looks something like this, and then different parts of the EEG are used to produce music. And then you listen to the same music. So it's a loop that lets you, in real life it looks like this. That's what's shown on that side. And so what we wanted to make it so that it's really mobile and you can walk around it and it's always there with you, so that it can become part of your senses. And what we've been able to do till now is only a prototype where you're still tethered to a computer. So you can't move around very easily, and you have some very simple synthetic sounds. But even with that, we've had limited success, but there are a couple of interesting things, and I want to play some sound samples. I'm glad the power is back. So what we found is we can change the music by trying to be in certain mental states. And one of the mental states that has worked is just closing our eyes and just relaxing. And this is what that sounds like. Okay, as opposed to if you're not trying to relax and you're sort of distracted, then it sounds like this. Not a big difference, but if you watch out, you can pick it out. And then there is trying to concentrate on something. So in this, we try to hold an object in our head, just anything. It can be a door handle, anything. And it sounds like this. So I'm going to go back to the first one with relaxed and eyes closed, just so you can see the difference again. Okay, so that's about it. But one of the main overlaps that I see between this and where I am and what's happening is that a lot of the geishas and the monastics, all of you on this side of the room, have a lot of experience in being in a particular mental state if you want to be. And so I'd be very interested to see what sort of music comes out of your brains. So for that reason, we're having a workshop on Monday and Tuesday. And in fact, today evening also, we're thinking of having a trial demo workshop. And anyone who's interested can come. Of course, I mean, I guess only one person can sit at the machine at a time. So we can take turns, and especially people who are going to leave before Monday, because Monday and Tuesday we'll have a lot of time. But anytime, anyone who's leaving by then can pop in today, and I think we can fix a time around 6 o'clock in the evening near the classrooms. So
You want to just show them?
yeah, I can sort of. So yeah, this is what the cap looks like. We stitched it into a cute little woolen cap, and then you just sort of wear it like this, right? And then you take this clip and you put it in your ear, right? And then you plug it into a computer with a wire, and then you got music from your brain. It looks pretty silly, I'm sure. There you go. Yeah, so I think that's it.
Okay, that's very provocative. I'm sure we have some questions.
단단히 경험하고 당 소자와 참말이야. 도마 장대시보다 단다 간주셔야 되니. 그냥 게라기 나축때 지시 무슨 나축 시바텔라 때네 아니 미시기 체지기 도미야. 안 잡았지 마라. 아니 쇼진다 간다지 가지지 되송세. 제와티. 펜도 가지 중송세.
So in your presentation, I think you said that you have some exposure to Buddhist traditions. So what? No. So yeah. And so if have some experience, then any impact on you?
Well, like I said, I think I said it in the context of this idea of there being no permanent experiencer, and just those very vague, abstract ideas is what I have a little familiarity with. And any impact, I'm sure it's having an impact on my research and the way I'm addressing these questions. But it's all very vague.
Kita dini gini juma chess dini bes namju chika the rubber dini kode dini mato. Kita the juma chumi bina ani page ta ngarang kita da nyam shipshia da dunzula shukjin yungres.
Sorry, also I'd like to add that while we're doing the workshop, I think it can impact us in a very concrete way if the Geshes share what they think about it, especially about being in the different mental states and making different music. And I think that's where the impact will be most.
Jadi tang antu jela ane Quran ki nyamdu ki sabjung ki choya chik ani teju lengi is. Jadi deka pula ani Geshe number 2 ki tanda Quran ki dingul labana shi andi nanglo la chashe lembi bina ani ngalungune ki ani ta chika shukjen tebe ayuna ani didi tepsa res chiza.
Hoya ngar chuwa chi da de kar se na kong ge da tin le chin ne churje dong on bola de je chin ne ni che zo gore nga chu de paro la su su ki hi da kong tho tong ya ge tham la ra da tin ri no se nga zu non chu ki tho le hi ba yi na da che zo gore dau se son so ma tham ji nga zu chen ni ji dra ong jo ma yi ba no ge ko ne lo ge za le dra ju yo wan ra ji tin ri chin ne nyam le chin jong tong yo re tin ri de ne ko no ji ge da di che zo gore that Yamote Kona Suzuki, Libidank, Drakanti Yomi, Trayomi, the Soma Tamji, Taji Jede, Penche Tel Pento Chimboji, Yundo Sangandos, Tindi Yungi Reves, Draiki Tondala, Yamne Jan, Tel Pento Yungi Reves.
So you have shown in the presentation how with the help of machines and instruments you can actually gain new experiences and new knowledge. And in Buddhist tradition, when we talk about experience and tuning your mind, you have to rely on your mental consciousness. So can we? So do you see any opportunity or possibility of using the new experience and the knowledge that we gain from these machines in our daily contemplative practices or mind trainings?
So I feel like this, what we can learn from something like this is just a more subtle, maybe slightly better understanding of the relationship between, let's say, brain and mind, or brain, body and mind. And what it translates to in daily contemplative practices or daily human practices of just being nice, or being good, or being sharp in mind and not getting distracted. I don't know what it will say for all those things. So as of now, don't know.
Tazada tanda tuji dinde laten che ane ngazu chike neju mangbu neju sawa raya da tigana shi nyamnyo sawa ki diki kharshi turis labin bena ane ngazu ki chike da leba da ane chike semsi yunire tigana shi ane leba da ane sheba lu sumki ane penjung parki ane dewa khandes chigi yome dik tol dewa khandes yome dik tola ane neju tis ta trajes raya ki pendo yongsi gres dimato ane nima nime ki ane chik susu nire ki tsowa chetan re tiga nashi dik nanglo la ane chik tiga nashi stem ki ta chik jongdar da dendre ki tola ane pendo yongu yome di ane nga she tu samaris tante chala
안다는 소자요나 아니 참디슈에다 아니 예든다 티와데 가르치나 네 겐조라게 아니 티카테 이샤르 센테조라이 아니 가지나 갱이든 용어의 거지 뭐 무슨 송수 어디 용어의 거 송해야 되는 잖아 지당 용어에 대 가서 거랑 용어 내야 돼 아니 다 지당이 당 어제 무슨 셈도 거지 라오래 야나 레베 용어 라오래 야나 티레 셴변이까지나 다 레베 치레 아니 다 셴바지 로스 샤야 그래서 용어 내야 돼 아니 용어 보래 줘라 어디 용어에 대 가서 거랑 용어 내야 돼 아니 세월을 보지래 저래 들어간다 저래.
So you talked about a lot of experiences in your presentation. So who is the one that experiences this experience? Is it the brain, or is it the mind, or is there a third entity who is actually experiencing these things?
Okay, I think the way I understand it, it's more about how one experience leads to another, and less about who the experiencer is. I mean, the idea is that the unity of a person is dependent on how one experience or one mental state moves from one to another, and that's what gives us ideas of continuity and ideas of self. And so it's difficult to answer that, of course, and that's why I like the idea of there being no permanent experience.
Chaza ani chike nyongwa denzo ani nyongken sure sia di ha koya le kecha di ani nyongwa denzo ani nyongwa chiki ani nyongwa shen khandes dengi yume di ani nge kecha antong yus chaza ta nyongwa chiki nyongwa shen de da thana shi ani sheba chiki ani shebe gu shenba de di ko toni ani chik nganzo mi 강사 지기 아니 뭐 전에다 안주 게르지 수수수 던제게 따단데도 아니 다 전에 도비한 대시가 도비아 지기 연구요레스 지단이 아니 디 티와드 카고레 디 용기 수레스 라신 주주실라비메나 아니 조야메스
There's no common experience maybe, but there is a common language. So, this is old philosopher stuff. When I experience red, I can communicate it to you. The red is not a wavelength of radiation. It's not a electrical signal or stimulus from my eye. It's redness that I can understand and you can understand, and we understand the same thing. So to me, can you explore that a little? Because if you have impermanence and transience of the experience, then how do we have this very strong commonality and a common language by which to share experiences?
Well, I think saying everything is fleeting and transient doesn't mean that there are no patterns. I mean, doesn't imply chaos of any kind. What it does imply is that what's more important than seeing a material is seeing the dynamics of that material and the way it engages with other materials. And I think it's just a way of stressing on looking at dynamics and how things interact more than what they're made of. And I think if you look at it like that, I don't think it's a contradiction that we share a language or anything like that.
아니 제가 아니 간소 카도 마우직 티와디 카도 마우직 아니 통의 값을라 아니 카도 마우 통의 그 용어디 아니 유르유베 카도 마우 대양 말에 대가는 신 아니 용견기 아니 레바 대양 미 레바 레기더다 그 셰바 레기나 대양 말에스 코 아니 디니니 냠도 델네 중외게 아니 다 용어지 차디 요레스 그래서 다디 아니 미게르 소소소라 아니 카도 마우 용외게 용어디 아니 만다 요빈베나 간소 아니 타니 그 토니 아니 투몽키 아니 데시자다 타니 베주치야 요레스 녜게 카도 마우 용송 세지다 아니 그게 아니 카도 마우 용소시디 오니 통 카도 마우 통그도 딘데시야 지요르와스 그래서 딜러 좀바다 용와세디 아니 딘데기 아니 치 만다 아니 지가 미다비 라시탄 교와도데니 상말라 아니 투몽 메와시 임비임비나 디낭로라 아니 지가 투몽키 아니 타니 베주제제 계제시 유도 아니 제사 딘데시 카리스 예우 송소 그래서 아니 디와델라 레스 아니 간조그 용와디 아니 소소수키 아니 투몽 카레 용와디 미게르수수키 만다 요레 디가나시 딘데기 용와디 아니 용와치기 용와신 제체 아니 교와도데니다 미다기 랑신 임비디베 교와지 요르데니미나 미다비 랑신 렌 교와두레 세두 잠발라 아디기 낭로라 아니 코림다 아니 투몽 그차 요마레스 요마레스 제자디 낭로 코림다 투몽 그차 요디겨레 제자 딜레자 아니 하 개체 찍라 아니 찍 유르여비케 니주디조 아니 찍 교와도당 칸데스레도 아니 교와도당 디기 토네 아니 간주기 딜라 아니 제와 차당 칸데스도 따당 칸데스 지도 통당 칸데스 교와두도 니 하고야 등이 개체를 섬고도 루시레스
This comes from the Geshes also. It's a good question, maybe for anyone on this side. This morning we heard that there is a connection between the brain and the mind, the thing we understand as the mind and the brain. But it's also understood that no scientist has discovered the mind or said exactly what it is. So how can you describe something when you have no idea what it is?
I think it's a mistake to think that scientists haven't defined the mind. I mean, we didn't talk about it, but there are actually very detailed ideas of what the mind is about. So let me just give you two quite well understood ideas of the mind, right? One is, because we just heard Nishant talk about vision. So one of the theories of vision, which is a central capacity of the mind, is that vision is understood as a mathematical capacity to take the input, the visual, the input that the retina gets from the impingement of light on the surface of the retina, and the ability to invert that and make it into a perception, right? So that's very precisely defined as a mathematical problem. You will not find something better defined than that. Of course, that may be a wrong theory, but it's a very well-defined theory. So mind is usually understood these days in terms of information processing. And that's by far the most dominant view of the mind.
Tiwadi any gila pajol yewe number sukyun and use Tiwad Karasana Shoge and also Lebada any Shevek Kola any Dewa Yuva the Haku Yores Himbina any Shevas Yadi Siribatuki any Tandabadu any Niemindus Chesa Tandabadu Mani Wiki any Churjik La any Keja Kandis Desha Kandis Chetures say the Tiwa Dreshas Chesa de Gela Koran di Len Karkuns Lavimina any Zeri Begi any Sheve Kola and Shingi Yomare Yamana Zeri Begi any Sheve Kola and Nezuni Shebani Yomare say di any colores any Zeri Nangula and Nazu Sheva say the Kangime and Nazota Kalasam Tanda and Deshi Tajiu Gayores. Dimazi and Tanda Sheva than Jeviki any Nezu Kechi Tanda Nishan Koran Sheva Nashin Karcha Yoris Lavimena Tanda any Sung Toya the Chagiro make Sung Tontobia. Make Sung Tontobia di any Shebeki any Chile Nalone Chile Cheshuji Chadi Yoris. Chesa Tanda any Dindeki any Tanda making Toya di tolong tongdang nganzu ki ani deshi gyathu yowa tamaze ani di angzi ki ani rodang ki thone ani zigor cheche ani deshi gyathu ya cha yores di ya khares labim bena ani chilo ni ani jigwe ki da ki thone ani mi ki traji thol powe ki ani nezu dunzu ji ani zik thone ta changka khari yowa dine ani nezu khari ya leba chimba di ani ta jik lebe ki khowa khanes lingi yume di ani zik thone ani toya ki ani neze ya le di yores cheda dile du zambala shebe ko la ani she mangbu yores cheda tande ki ani sheba siya dita ani deshi zo jik ani khanes ya yores la bimena ani jik nezu information lagi do konso cheda di ani da yogyur se ore ta ya duya da ani pa lent ya dine jik thone deshi yores.
This one is from the audience, and on the same topic is for Geshe-la. So we've heard scientists comment on their understanding and measurement of the brain and their idea of mind. What does Buddhism have to say about the difference between the mind and the brain?
This is very easy question. I'm joking. We talk about grosser level of consciousness, subtle level of consciousness, the most subtle level of consciousness. And we say that the grosser level of consciousnesses are dependent on physical entities like the brain. So there is the relation of the brain with the consciousness. But as and when you go to the subtlemost part, for example, at the time of the death, then you experience the subtlemost part of the mind, then all the grosser level of the consciousness dissolved into the more subtler one, then finally into the most subtle consciousness, which is called the luminous mind, and that mind then becomes completely independent from the dependence on the grosser level of the body. So I think the question was also in relation to that.
Okay, thank you. Any more from the Geshes? Yes.
Tanda nashin la di nyongbi korji songsonga. Nyongba saya di ta nga zo ge ji chorwa ji la ngin zing ge yo na me na da ta nga zo nyong chor saya da ni ji chor shi saya da din di ge tan ni mang bu ji yo wa. Din di yin song za chorwa ji la ni ngin zing ge yo biang da dang bai na nga zo chorwa di la nga zo nang bi jong bi nang la chorwa di de dang yun saya ge ni tan ni sim ji she ge yo re. Din di ge ji ni kar so re da chorwa ji yin dang ma yin se. Ke se ni chorwa di 다 초로 용바보디 강도 요담식도와 용바보디 강도 요메 이제 집에 가블라 천리비 좀다 천리비 다 지바이나 바나 레비 용거 요레스 레비 초르거 요레스 바나 아니 파게 지금 미지라 니 라비 라비 캅수 미게 라바 추바디 니 수초르거 요르스나 야 레발라 다테니 달림바디야 다테니 아니 이게 아니 레비나라 다 레니디 다 랑비 슈스 니코 다저 라바 미 작은 도시야가 니지 다지 테니 고 초르기 요레스야지 드니 손자 초르와디 아니 다 도디나 니지 레빈낭라 요바르베 아니 리 지용라다 니 지치니 강추버 캡데비니 지 다가스 지지암 양나 지미기 아니 니보지 레스야 다 도디.
This is for Nishant. And so when we talk about the experience, is experience same as feeling? Or is it, when we talk about the feeling in Buddhist traditions, we can talk about the feeling in three categories of positive, negative, and neutral. And I also heard from the science classes that when we talk about the feeling in neuroscience, actually the brain is the one who feels your body sensations. For example, if your hand is hurt, so the information goes from your hand to the brain, and then brain interprets or the brain feels that your hand is burning. So do you believe that brain is responsible for feeling, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral? Or do you think that there's something, whether it's physical or non-physical, which is pervades all over the body?
I think the pain question is quite easy in a way, because in terms of experience, it's quite clear that what pains is your hand, and your brain never pains. I mean, unless you have a headache or like something over there. But if you are experiencing something with your hand, it is also located in your hand. I mean, if my finger pains, it is my finger that seems to pain. And while the brain might be playing a role in that whole relationship, I think it's wrong to say that the brain would be feeling the pain. Coming back to the difference between experience and feeling, I think experience is a more general term only because feeling is used. Actually, feeling is used in two different senses. One is an emotion, right? You feel happy, you feel, so it has balance, it has value. Whereas experience is, I think, a more neutral term of saying the same thing, whether it's this way or that way. Because, like Chris said, you can experience red, and that's not necessarily a good or a bad feeling. I mean, of course, in different contexts it can be. If anyone else wants to add anything to that.
Wait, can we...
Okay, I'll translate first. I may miss. Certain any Torah love capsula, any Torah the label yoris, any like means, and Torah the Kawa yoris, any Zugu Yuvena, any Sorsa, patient Nazuku Shimbana, the Kawani Yunguina, Lakwan Yunguina, Kangan Yunguina, and the Dela and Zuzu Sares. Certain any Torah Karium, Yonsia de la, any Lebek, Dick, Nano, Chile, Yorves, and any Yocho res, Himbina, any label yoris, any Lagu Yomaris and Gudus. Teganashita, Yumada, any Torek Pal and Devakari yoris, Sambala, any Yumas, they are Dichita, any Tanya Koran, any Tanium, Char, Yungures, Jeta and Kokogu, Kodu, Dao Yubimbina. Jeta, Towa Sidu Zambala, Towa Sia, the Namjun, emotion, sensors, Yorota, and Dida, and Tanya, Chang Zambala, Dig Nalola, Energy Susuda, Gauda, any Migaya, Energy Sangam Kineba Mangochik, and de la Deshia Yungures to Suns.
Okay, Eric.
It gets back to the question about where is the location of perception. And some people might argue that the brain is the one and perhaps only organ of perception. And one of the things that we discussed in class was phantom limb pain, for example. And that is when a body part is actually removed, a person still feels that body part even though the body part is absent. It can also be thought of that our sense organs are not even necessary for perception. Without eyes, we can still see. Without a body part, we can still feel. And if those body parts are missing, where is perception? Is it still, how can it be in the part that's missing? So it might be argued that the brain is the one and perhaps only organ of perception.
So the digit ama Pabza the Kwa, Pabris Lamimena, Manzuk Naloni, any Tajik Shezur to me, any Wangodi Carres, Yadi, Pabuyores. Cheza de Dindeki, any Manzuk Subuk Nanglola, any Chika Wangbungi, Union, Nizu, and Musta, Shezur Kunin, Zuzu, Yubina, and the Lebal Ha, Shamba, and Zuzu Sayomares. Kazan Zinjik Nanglola, she and Bas Nanzu Santa, and Dongdik Lakwal Syrian Siadi. Cheza Dinzu, the Caris Labimena, Miduzu, Kala Chesimbaris, Kala Yomarid in Imbina, Tanduya, any Kala Yoviki, any Sorwana Shinche, any Nazatayada, any Dinuyur was Cheza de la Duzambala, Takeja Kawaleris Labimena, any Dindeki, any soup that you reject than Deviki, any Yonsul, Kiala, any Wangbudenzo, Dedan Devik, Wangbudenzoya, Mogo, Tony, Labajibu, Tony, any Yon Tomatoki, any some lady Uris, the data, Tanda Dongik, Yanasi, Dinzo, Shimbina, Lagua Mevi, any Lagua Yoviki, any Yawanchi Yor was, Chazadi, Zuzu Sadi, the Lagua de Medu, level Zuzu Resta.